Chapter 20. Appendix B. Re Mr. Edward Davy. Short Memoir of Edward Davy, MRCS, MSA, by Henry Davy, M.D. Law, MRCP. Physician to the Devon and Exeter Hospital. Reprinted from the Electrician and The following short biographical sketch of my uncle has been written by me at the request of Mr. Fahie in order to complete the history of the MSS, which he has lately published. Edward Davy's family originally settled near the coast in Dorsetshire, where about the year 1616 they were living on their own estates, unfortunately. They took an active part against the King in the Monmouth Rebellion, and when Judge Jeffreys commenced the bloody assize, they found it convenient to migrate into Devonshire, where they commenced life afresh, mostly pursuing the occupation of farmers. His grandfather was a farmer, J.R.ly owning, and partly renting his estates in the neighbourhood of Exeter, while his father was Thomas Davy, who resided at Ottery St. Mary and had an extensive medical practice in Ottery and the neighborhood. Thomas Davy was educated at Ottery and Guy's Hospital, at the latter being a pupil of Sir Astley Cooper, but from the time he left London it is much to be questioned whether he was ever out of Devonshire more than 5 or 6 times in his life. Edward Davy was born on June 6, 1806, and was educated at a school kept by his maternal uncle, Mr. Buttflower in Tower Street, London. Subsequently, he was apprenticed to Mr. Wheeler, house surgeon at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And about the year 1828, he became a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, and soon after a member of the Society of Apothecaries. Shortly after this, he bought a business at 390 Strand. I have always heard it stated that some £800 or £900 were advanced by his father to buy a medical practice, but that he was taken in, and found that the so-called practice was that of a dispensing chemist. However this may be, he soon began to trade as an operative chemist under the name of Davy and Company, and in 1836 he published a small work, termed Experimental Guide to Chemistry, at the end of which is a catalogue of the instruments, and supplied by his firm. This guidebook might even now serve as a useful textbook for a beginner in experimental work. Whilst in the catalogue at the end, he mentioned several of his original modifications of instruments, such as Davy's blowpipe, Davy's improved mercurial trough, and proving how completely he had given himself up to his favorite pursuit. About this time, 1835, he invented and patented a cement for mending broken china and glass, which for many years brought him in a small income, and was well known as Davy's Diamond Cement. And it was during these years that he first commenced to experiment on the electric telegraph. But this part of his history up to the time of his leaving England has already been told by Mr. Fahie. One question which will be asked by all the readers of Mr. Fahie's narrative is, why did Edward Davy fail in his attempt to get his system of telegraphy adopted? It seems certain that at the time of his leaving England, his system was in a more perfect state than that of Cooke and Wheatstone. It is seen, too, that Edward Davy was and had been negotiating with some of the leading engineers, railway companies, and railway directors, and that many of them had promised to adopt his system. Why then did he fail? Chiefly because he left England just at the wrong moment. Into the reasons of his leaving, there is no occasion to enter. Suffice it to say, he had been contemplating doing so all through the end of 1837 and 1838. And that his reasons were entirely of a private kind. But in leaving England he struck the death blow to all his hopes. And had he remained, Fahie Appendix B, a system, as Mr. Fahie says, would probably have been adopted. It is important to note that he himself did not realize the fact that his leaving England would ruin his invention, and that had he realized his true position, he would probably have stayed on until his negotiations with the railway companies were concluded. In a letter to his father early in 1839, in which he announces his final decision to leave, he says, "I have perfected as far as I can, secured and made public the telegraph. What remains, to make the bargain with the companies when they are ready and willing can be managed by an agent or attorney, as well as if I were present. How entirely wrong this opinion was subsequent events soon proved, for the directors, having no one to deal with who thoroughly understood his instruments, adopted those of his rivals, Cooke and Wheatstone. But other causes greatly contributed to his failure. The first is brought out in the sketch I have given of his family. His father was for his day a well-qualified medical man, but he was quite destitute of any scientific training, whilst his close residence in Devonshire had prevented his seeing the direction in which the thought of the day was moving. To most people in 1837, the idea even of a railway was new, and when Edward Davy talked of sending messages along a wire for hundreds of miles, when he predicted the use of marine cables, hinted at the telephony, and prophesied that the government would adopt the telegraph as part of their postal system, it is excusable that his father should regard him as a visionary and should tell him that his plans were all moonshine. When, too, he found that he had to pay for this moonshine by constant remittances, one can easily forgive his anxiety that his son should go back to the regular practice of his profession. Especially when to his old-fashioned ideas, it was almost a disgrace for a medical man to have a son an operative chemist. Not only did his father discourage Edward Davy in his pursuits, but he took no pains to bring his invention to the notice of many influential friends, who might have helped him in his endeavors to make it known to the public. From Mr. Fahie's narrative, it seems evident that had any well-known firm taken up the invention and pressed its advantages on the public, the railway directors would have adopted it. Thomas Davy's brother was a merchant of wide local reputation, who at one time had been one of the government's largest contractors for building wooden frigates, while his nephew was a rising partner in one of the best-known and largest mercantile houses of the day, Anthony Gibbs and Company. And yet neither of these was in the least made acquainted with the patent of the electric telegraph. This was the more deplorable since Edward Davy was evidently unfortunate in his choice of businessmen. Repeatedly in his letters to his father, he states that neither Mr. P nor Captain B nor Mr. B was assisting him as he should wish. And had he been assisted by any energetic man of business, it is probable that Mr. Fahie's history would have ended very differently. Like most other geniuses, Edward Davy had no marked business capacity. He could invent an original machine. He was not able to hold his own with far-seeing men of the world. He had no friend to advise him, and he was unfortunate in the agents whose assistance he obtained. Had he offered 50% of his eventual gains, he would have attracted the service of men of acknowledged position. As it was, his offer of ID% did not attract these, and even when he offered 25% to Mr. P, the latter did not keep his part of the undertaking, so that the compact broke through. After careful perusal of the MS, I am convinced that Edward Davy did everything in his own power to make his invention succeed. He failed because he had little business capacity, and his father's line of action prevented his getting even friendly advice from quarters where it might have been obtained. But the questions will be asked. Why has Edward Davy allowed his claims as a pioneer in telegraphy to be so completely ignored? And why have not his family published these MSs before? The answer to the latter question is simple. I very much doubt if the family knew anything about these MSs. They were collected and labeled by another uncle of mine long since dead, and it was only after the death of my father last year that they fell into my hands after having narrowly escaped being burned as rubbish. They came into my possession last March, and when by chance Mr. Fahie in April 1883 wrote to ask me for information as to my uncle, I readily placed them at his disposal, only stipulating that, as he was quite a stranger to me, he should publish nothing without my permission. Until I saw his annotations, I was not aware of the extent of Edward Davy's inventions, and I am quite sure my father had no idea as to the value of these MSEs, for his training as a solicitor had not taught him any science. I do not know why Edward Davy himself allowed his claims to be ignored. Probably he did not know that these MS had been preserved, and without them, he would have no proof with which to support his claims. After leaving England in 1839, he threw all his energies into the colonial life he had adopted. His letters to his father, mother, and brothers are full of references to this new mode of life. He busied himself in acclimatizing trees, grasses, and sea, the seeds of which he obtained from England. His leisure he fewed up with writing newspaper articles on hygiene and other subjects. He also pursued his favorite subject, chemistry, and patented a plan for saving fuel during the process of smelting ores, which he had invented in 1838. For many years he was assayer to the Mint at Melbourne, while for the past 25 years he has carried on a medical practice, latterly in partnership with one of his sons. In this busy colonial age, he has no doubt found more happiness than in brooding over his disappointment. Only in one letter to his family do I find any reference to the Telegraph. Writing to one of his sisters in 1841. After saying that a storm is preventing him from going to sleep, he adds, "I shall therefore enter into some conversation with you, although from there being no electric telegraph. It may be 5 months ere my voice reaches you. Whatever be the cause, it is certain that he has never once referred to this period of his affaire, and, as Mr. Fahie says, he will be quite as surprised as anyone at finding that his labors of 45 years ago have now been made public." Mr. Fahie concludes the narrative of Edward Davy's inventions and negotiations by terming it a magnificent failure, and I think no one will deny this who has read how nearly he obtained complete success. It was, however, only a failure as far as he himself was concerned. His labors were, in reality, most useful. His experiments in Regent's Park, his exhibition of his instrument in Exeter Hall, brought electric telegraphy before the public in a way which was done by no other person. His correspondence with, and the constant advocacy of his invention, to such men as Bruni, Fox, and Eashope, forced the electric telegraph on their notice with a double force and, no doubt, did much to cause its early adoption. I do not here enter into the question as to how far his ideas were adopted by others. It is certain that, with a strange lack of business-like foresight, he exhibited his machine before it was patented, and that his exhibition was visited by Cook, Wheatstone, and C. Probably his work has assisted many of his successors in working out improvement. But quite apart from this, his labors were useful and are well worthy of recognition. It is interesting to note that he spent some thousands in experimenting and making his experiments public. Mr. Fahie has shown me a letter printed in The Electrician, October 11, 1879, from the late Dr. Cornish, vicar of Ottery St. Mary. This letter says, "Edward Davy's family spent £30,000 on the electric telegraphs. I do not know whether there is a misprint here, but if the 30 be divided by 10, I think the resulting 3,000 would be more near the mark." It is also interesting to note that Edward Davy is still alive and well appreciated by his fellow townsmen in his colonial home. Almost the last paper I got from him contained an account of an entertainment given in his honor, at which, he having refused any more substantial acknowledgment, he was presented with an illuminated address in recognition of his having been for many years a magistrate and on 3 occasions mayor of his town, and for having for 25 years gratuitously held the office of medical officer of health to the district. It is to me a satisfaction that these MSs have come to light during his lifetime. He is now 77 years of age, and for the past 45 years his claims have been quite ignored. He, I am sure, would be the last to claim any position, which was undeserved. But it cannot but be a pleasure to him to see the real value of his work recognized, and his name rescued from an unmerited oblivion, and placed in its proper position as one of the very first pioneers of electric telegraphy. A writer in the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette for September 25, 1883, supplies the following additional information. My attention having been called to the series in The Electrician by a recent article from the pen of the ubiquitous Harry Hems, I made inquiries of an old and respected inhabitant of Ottery, Mr. Geoffrey Solicitor, who knew the Davy family well. He says that at the end of the last century, Thomas Davy, surgeon, commenced practice at Ottery St. Mary. Soon after, he married the daughter of a uterary gentleman of Exeter named Boutflower. Trade in the town of Ottery at that time was brisk. In the year 1782, a large woolen manufactory was completed, at a ruinous cost to Sir George Young Bart, the then lord of the manor. The manufactory was conducted by Messrs. Ball and Fowle, a daughter of the former of whom is still alive. It was always said that Mr. Davy was of the same family as Sir Humphrey Davy, who was born at Penzance in the year 1778. He also was intended for the medical profession, and served under an apothecary in order to study chemistry, a circumstance that resulted in his invention of the Davy safety lamp, the metallic basis of the alkalis and earths, and of the principles of electrochemistry. Mr. Thomas Davy had possessions in the West Indies, and held them until his death in the year 1852. At the end of the last century, a large fire occurred in Mill Street, Ottery, in a butcher's shop occupied by a person named James. Mr. Thomas Davy became the purchaser of the ruins and erected on the site a mansion where he resided until his death. He was blessed with 4 sons and 2 daughters. Edward Davy, the inventor of telegraphy, was the eldest son. At an early age, he showed precocity, and having his father's surgery at command, he, for a time, quite gave himself up to the study of chemistry, particularly electrochemistry. He was convinced that the time would arrive when communication would be made by wire around the world. Later on in life, he left Ottery for London, where he married the daughter of a London magistrate named Minshaw. He then again followed his old hobby and expressed himself confident of discovering the secret of communication by telegraphy. At last, he accomplished his end and took a room in the Exeter Hall Strand, where his instrument, not unlike a piano, was exhibited. He cut letters from a printed bill and gummed them on to the keys. Wires were placed round the room, which he said were 1 mile long. Attached were a number of small jets-like lamps, placed at intervals, which he instantaneously H'd to the wire, he said to his audience. The most extraordinary part of it is that if I touch one of these letters, it moves a corresponding letter instantaneously at the end of the wire. A person asked if distance made any difference, and Mr. Davy replied, "No. If I had these wires 3,000 miles long, or even round the world, one could not discover the difference of time." Strange to say, he ultimately sold his discovery and right for 600 and left for Australia. As a young man, he took a great interest also in geology and frequently started off from Ottery to examine the hills in the district. On reaching Melbourne, he pursued his study of geology, and in due time appeared an article from his pen in the Melbourne Argus, which, by the by, was edited by a gentleman who had been educating his grammar school when kept by the vicar of Ottery, Dr. Cornish, showing that he was of opinion that the country or certain parts of it was auriferous. This article Mr. Thomas Davy retained up to the time of his death, and often read it to his friends. Mr. Thomas Davy had an extensive practice at Ottery. He had more than an ordinary share of common sense, and was amiable and kind, particularly to the poor. For many years he studied the art of producing fat stock, and was the only person who then grew mangelwurzel in the parish, which was called at that period by the farmers a gentleman's crop. He was brother to the late, I had almost said centenarian of Topsham, James Davy, whose remarkable career is worthy of notice, and who possessed a successful business for over 60 years in a shipbuilding, coal, and lime trade. Although deprived of sight for a great number of years, his energy of mind and body was not impaired. He was benevolent and much respected. The only representative of Mr. Thomas Davy left in the county is Dr. Davy of Exeter. We make the following extract from the Melbourne Argus for November 16th, 1883. Royal Society of Victoria. The ordinary monthly meeting of the Royal Society was held on Thursday evening. Mr. R.L.J. Urey in the chair. Mr. Urey read the following paper describing an interesting fact in connection with the early history of the electric telegraphs. It is no new thing to say that the one who, by intellectual process or rational experiment, makes a discovery seldom reaps the benefit, either as regards reputation or more substantial results. The man of science, or the patient investigator, is nowhere in the race as compared with the man of business, and so it often, almost always, happens that the discoverer is forgotten, while those who Ghoul-liked turn his brains to account are the only ones who reap the reward and are remembered. This is because men like Faraday, and many more, are not businessmen. Their life is spent in inquiring of nature's forces and nature's laws, and giving the results for the benefit of mankind, and not in learning and following the more popular ways of money-making. The instance I'm about to refer to is a case in point. Let us think for a moment what a mess we should be in if we were suddenly deprived of the electric telegraph, or electricity as a means of communication at a distance, and we may perhaps form some sort of an idea of what we owe to those early workers who laid the foundation stones of this great and universal benefit. Nevertheless, one, as it now seems likely, the first who by his discoveries made the electric telegraph a fact, has been hidden among us for over 30 years, scarcely known except as a country surgeon, and certainly never till now recognized as one to whom the gratitude, if nothing else, of the whole civilized world belongs for his investigations into the applications of electricity and magnetism, which are now considered by competent authorities to have constituted those first important steps which rendered all subsequent details of the electric telegraph an easy task. From some articles in The Electrician, it is pretty clear that Dr. Edward Davy, who was known by some of us 30 years ago as superintendent of the Assay Office in Melbourne, was one of the founders of the Philosophical Institute, the parent of this Royal Society, and now resides at Malmesbury, following his profession as a medical man, must be regarded in virtue of his most important discoveries, exhibitions of working models at Exeter Hall, and his invitation to carry out his electric telegraph on the Great Western Line in England, the real first inventor of the electric telegraph. The history in brief seems to be this. As early as 1836, Davy conceived the possibility of an electric telegraph and appears to have had an excellent knowledge and thorough grasp of the properties of electricity. He had been educated for the medical profession and took his diploma at the Royal College of Surgeons in 1828. He then seems to have taken up the business of an operative or analytical chemist, and we have heard of several chemical instruments invented or improved by him. During this time, about 1835, he seems to have made some investigations into electricity, and in 1836, the possibility of using the electric current for telegraphic purposes suggested itself to him, and he matured a method which he patented in 1838, as already stated. Cook and Wheatstone patented in 1837, and afterwards actually carried their needle telegraph into operation and obtained its adoption on the railway lines of Great Britain. Davy, who had matured his plan and exhibited working models before this time, contested unsuccessfully the granting of the patent, perhaps from the want of means, or perhaps for lack of the commercial afflatus so often absent in scientific men. Yet, so essential to the substantial success of a discovery or invention, Davy failed to carry his telegraph into practical use, and eventually we hear of his having come to Australia in 1839. His connection with the early discovery of the electric telegraph was forgotten, nor does he ever seem to have in any way resuscitated the matter until his work is referred to in Mr. Fahie's papers on the early history of the electric telegraph, published lately in The Electrician, although Cook and Wheatstone succeeded and Dr. Davy did not. This does not alter the fact that to the latter we are decidedly indebted for discoveries which eventually resulted in the perfection of both what are known as the needle and Morse systems. To those interested in this subject, I may state that copies of Dr. Davy's work and inventions can be seen in The Electrician, Volumes 8, 9, 10, and all of this year. There is, however, one paragraph taken from his letters and communications which is interesting and prophetic. It is in a postscript to a letter to his father, dated July 1838, speaking of a suggestion that had been made to the effect that government would scarcely allow such a powerful instrument to be in the hands of individuals. He says, "I know very well the French government would not permit it except in their own hands. But though I think our government ought, and perhaps will eventually take it upon themselves as a branch of the post office, yet I can scarcely imagine that there would be such absurd illiberality as to prohibit or appropriate it without compensation." Again in 1838, Davy wrote, "I cannot, however, avoid looking at the system of electrical communication between distant places in a more enlarged way, as a system which will one of these days become an especial element in social intercourse. As railways are already doing, it will tend still further to bring remote places, in effect, near together. If the one may be said to diminish distance, the other may be said to annihilate it altogether. Being instantaneous, there is a ring of prescience in these words, uttered as they were 45 years ago. Before a mile of telegraph wire had been erected except the single mile, he constructed himself for experimental purposes in Regent's Park. And although, so far as is known, the idea of submarine communication was at that time scarcely dreamt of, Davy, in his Alfney description of his improved electrical telegraph, refers to and describes an insulated conductor or cable for such a purpose. This society will, I am sure, feel proud to know that it may rank among its founders the name of Edward Davy, the almost forgotten pioneer and inventor of the electric telegraph. And at the 11th hour, to do what honor to him it may be within its province and power to do. Mr. Ewer intimated, amidst applause, his intention to move at next meeting that Dr. Davy be elected a life honorary member of the Society. Professor Kernot thought a much higher honor was due to Dr. Davy if he was really the actual first discoverer of the electric telegraph. Mr. C.R.A. Blackett suggested the appointment of a subcommittee to look into the matter and report as to the best means of recognizing the scientific services of Dr. Davy. The suggestion was adopted, the subcommittee appointed being Messrs. S.W. McGowan, J. Cosmo Newberry, C.R. Blackett, Professor Kernot, and Dr. Wilkie. The following paragraph appeared in The Electrician for January 12, 1884. Chang Edward Davy. The graphic and interesting accounts of Edward Davy's telegraphic inventions, which have appeared in these pages from the pen of Mr. J. Fahie, have aroused considerable interest in the colony of Victoria, Dr. Davy's adopted home. We notice that Mr. Urey recently read a paper before the Royal Society of Victoria in which he concurred with Mr. Fahie in thinking that if Davy had stayed instead of emigrating to Australia in disgust, he would have succeeded in establishing his claim to be the first inventor of the electric telegraph. At the conclusion of his paper, Mr. Ellery proposed that the Society should do him such honor as lay in their power by electing him a life honorary member. The meeting, however, were of opinion that Dr. Davy deserved some still better recognition of his so long neglected genius, and appointed a subcommittee to report upon the best means of doing him public honor. We hope that our colonial kinsfolk will not be allowed to entirely show us the way in this matter. Davy lived in London and exhibited his apparatus here long before he went to live in Australia. Who can tell how much modern telegraphy is indebted to the inventive genius of the chemist who resided at 390 Strand? Had he stayed here, he would no doubt have exercised a very powerful influence on the history of the telegraph. For, as Mr. Fahie has so ably shown, he was far in advance of his contemporaries, both in theory and practice. Circumstances caused him to leave us, and he was for a time forgotten. Do not let us forget how much he is deserving of honor at our hands, however. Not a mere empty, formal, and official recognition of his services, but something substantial, and that may prove of benefit to the man himself in his declining years. Why not place his name on the civil list, as has been already suggested? There are many far less deserving than Dr. Davy to be counted in this HSD. We feel sure that the many telegraph engineers and electricians of the present day who know how to appreciate Davy's genius will not allow their colonial brethren to outdo them in honoring him, nor let the matter sleep for want of a little energy. It is curious to notice that Dr. Davy was not altogether fortunate in his Australian career, and that misfortune came upon him through no fault of his. It appears that Dr. Davy was a say master at the Melbourne Mint from 1853 to 1855, and enjoyed a salary of $1,500. This was when Mr. Latrobe was governor. Dr. Davy had been specially invited to accept this post whilst occupying another similar, but less lucrative position in Adelaide. A succeeding governor, however, Sir Charles Hotham, abolished the office, giving Dr. Davy, by way of compensation, 6 months' salary. Here then was Davy once more turned adrift by fortune's wheel. At the time that he was at Melbourne, Mr. Childers, the present Chancellor of the Exchequer, was Auditor General there. After this, Davy tried his hand at farming with but indifferent success, and finally settled down in Malmesbury to practice his profession of surgeon. Here he gradually rose high in popular esteem, has been several times mayor, and has been prime mover in several local public works of great benefit to the town. Dr. Davy is now in his 78th year, and is not so well able to carry on his profession as in his younger days, and from various causes his practice is not so good as it used to be. Consequently, a grant from the civil list would be as good a mode of honoring him as that. And we think it ought to be made,